Hey everyone! Today we're diving into one of Japan's most chaotic and intense eras, the Sengoku Period, or as it's often called, the Warring States Period. Imagine a time from 1467 to 1568 where Japan was constantly on edge, warlords battling left and right, each vying for control. It was brutal, unpredictable, and changed the landscape of Japan forever. This all started in the Muromachi period, when Japan was technically united under the Ashikaga Shogunate, based in the capital, Heian-kyo, today's Kyoto. But while the capital enjoyed a level of order, the outer provinces were practically left to fend for themselves. Local warlords, or daimyō, ruled their lands almost like independent kingdoms, and the central government had little say over them. The chaos truly began with the Onin War in 1467. What started as a dispute between powerful families spiraled into a devastating conflict that tore Heian-kyo apart. Over the next century, Japan fractured into countless feudal territories, each controlled by a daimyo who built his power through sheer force, alliances, and of course battles. Now, these daimyo were a mixed group. Some were from old aristocratic families, others were former governors who broke away, and there were even some who simply seized power through grit and determination, building armies of samurai and anyone else willing to fight. This constant reshuffling of power was called Gekkokuho, which translates roughly to the low overthrowing the high. It meant that in this period, anyone ambitious enough could rise to power, often by taking down those who came before them. With the Ashikaga Shogunate weakened and the shogun, Yoshimasa, more interested in art than government, there was hardly any central rule. The law of the land was simple: whoever was strongest ruled. Daimyo fortified their territories with castles and walls, building many kingdoms that operated almost entirely independently. Each lord collected taxes, controlled commerce, and laid down their own laws, from how peasants could farm to even banning certain luxuries, just to save money. And the real chaos of the Sengoku period erupted with the Onin War, or Onin no Ran, which raged from 1467 to 1477. This civil war kicked off because of a fierce rivalry between two powerful clans, the Hosokawa and the Yamana. It quickly spiraled out of control, dragging most of Japan's biggest families into the conflict. At its core, the war revolved around a dispute over the title of shogun, though, honestly, the title held little real power by then. Historians often see the Onin War as a product of overly ambitious warlords who had trained armies and nothing to do with them, so they seized any excuse for a fight. By the time the war finally wound down in 1477, Japan was left without any clear winner and no one in control. The destruction was staggering. Kyoto, the capital, was practically leveled. The violence was so intense that, by the end, only birds filled the streets where once thriving shops and temples had stood. One chronicler even captured the desolation with a haunting line: "For blocks on end, birds are the sole sign of life." And a somber poem from the time described Japan as a bird with two beaks pecking itself to death, capturing the country's tragic descent into ruin. But while the war left much of Japan in ruins, it also revealed which daimyo were the strongest. Only a few survived with enough power and resources, shrinking Japan's feuding warlords down to around 250 by 1600. This consolidation meant that armies grew larger and more complex, with tens of thousands of soldiers in specialized roles, from foot soldiers called ashiguru, to cavalry, and even people dedicated to logistics. Warfare itself evolved. Lighter, mobile weapons like halberds and pikes became popular, and later on, even matchlock firearms made their way onto the battlefield. Of course, all this violence and upheaval led to myth-making, particularly around the samurai. Stories began to glorify them as noble warriors, disciplined, skilled, and loyal, much like the knights of medieval Europe. These tales helped daimyo cultivate a heroic image, intimidating rivals and rallying their own followers. This era also saw a boom in castle building. Daimyo needed strongholds to defend against attacks, so castles popped up everywhere, in towns, on mountain passes, along critical roads. Some, like the Asakura family's fortress at Ikijodani, or the Takeda family's moated Tsutsujigasaki, became well-known symbols of strength. Entire towns called Jokomachi sometimes grew around these fortresses. While these castles didn't yet have the multi-tiered stone towers of later periods, they were still sophisticated defenses, with wooden structures on solid stone bases, complete with walls, gates, and narrow windows perfect for archers. With central government control virtually non-existent, many villages took matters into their own hands, forming local councils to make laws, manage resources, and organize festivals. Some villages even banded together to create leagues, or iki, that defended themselves against local lords and sometimes even won skirmishes. In other areas, peasants used the daimyo's absence during campaigns to push for better treatment and conditions, with some provinces seeing large-scale revolts. Meanwhile, towns grew bigger, spurred by booming trade. Weekly markets, guilds, and a growing demand for luxury goods like Ming porcelain kept commerce bustling, with many towns swelling to over 30,000 people. And as villages and towns flourished, Buddhist temples began to lose power. Without government backing, they couldn't demand contributions as before and faced hard times, especially when one warlord came to power who wasn't interested in honoring tradition. This warlord was none other than Oda Nobunaga. He was a game-changer, steadily growing his power from his base at Nagoya Castle through the 1550s and 60s, defeating rival clans with his skillful strategies and his bold use of firearms. In 1568, Nobunaga finally took Kyoto, marking the beginning of Japan's unification. He exiled the last Ashikaga shogun in 1573, ending that shogunate for good. Nobunaga's conquest was only the beginning, as his successors, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, would carry Japan further down the path to unity and peace, leading into the next phase of Japanese history, the Azuchi Momoyama period.